Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's review, we are jumping into a single brewer review. Today it's going to be Dogfish Head Brewery, and we are doing two different IPAs. The first is their Indian Brown. This is a dark IPA, 7.2%, and it's been brewed with organic brown sugar. And then the second one is Burton Baton. This is an imperial IPA, 10% ABV, and it's a blend of two different IPAs. It's a blend of a young IPA and older oak-aged IPA. So ought to be really interesting and see how that mixes together. Dogfish is based out of Milton, Delaware, and we're gonna get jumping right in, starting with the Indian Brown, the dark IPA at 7.2% ABV. Okay, so jumping into our first beer, this is the Indian Brown. This is a dark IPA, 7.2% ABV, and it has been brewed with organic brown sugar and obviously dark malts in this sense. So dark IPA, black IPA, whatever you want to call it. Nonetheless, it should be dark. So let's get this poured right in the glass. Oh, not a black IPA. They did call it what it is, a dark IPA. Kind of a similar hue to a brown ale. Rough it up. This glass is so wide-mouthed it is really a challenge to get good heads formed, but that's okay since I forgot before I was over halfway done. Okay, holding it up, you can see light through it, though really it is still quite dark, about the color of a brown ale. Head formed okay considering. Oh, it smells really nice. It's got this slight sweetness to it and just a little bit of a hint of a boozy quality to it. It doesn't smell overtly hoppy, which for an IPA, I mean, it could all be hiding in the flavor profile here and not necessarily come through in the aroma, but it smells very malty, very sweet, and just a hint of booziness to it. Obviously, this glass, it's a good glass, but for head formation and retention, it's not great. I should probably reserve it for styles where a head's not really appropriate, but it's still got a little cling to the sides, despite how poorly I poured. Let's jump right in, give this a sip. Ooh, okay. Okay, that's nice. When it first, ooh, wow, it gets better as this finish keeps going. Oh, this is very interesting beer. This beer, oh, this is really, really good. This is really, really good. And it's really interesting. Wow. I'm legitimately, positively amazed and blown away by this. This is not what I expected at all. Okay, when you first get this beer in your mouth, you get that sweetness that you could detect. And then it opens up, and the flavor opens up into what really reminds me most similarly to a strong ale. Kind of a similar flavor profile without being as hoppy as, say, Stone's Arrogant Bastard Strong Ale. It's a very similar flavor profile. And once that opens up, that's kind of when that slight boozy edge disappears. Then it opens up into a completely different direction I didn't anticipate. And it tastes strongly of coffee, like a deep, rich coffee stout. I'm going to read this label, see if it mentions anything about coffee. Nope. Brown ale meets well-hopped IPA. Dark malt, organic brown sugar, and dry hopped. So no coffee, but man, that's such an interesting flavor ride. To start from sweet to go into what tastes like a strong ale and then completely turn tail and get in like a deep, rich coffee stout. I did not anticipate that at all. And this is not super pungently bitter, but it does have a bitter back to it. So, you know, you can tell it's an IPA. It's not pungent. This is not pungently bitter, but it's definitely in there. Body, it's actually pretty heavy. I'd say it's high end of medium heavy, low end of heavy. It's got some real weight to it. Mouthfeel is quite creamy and it's definitely got some viscosity. 7.2% ABV, I'm not really surprised by the body or the mouthfeel. Gosh, that finish just keeps developing and is blowing my mind. This is such a good beer. This is really interesting, and this is really, really good beer. I didn't expect this at all. I am so pleasantly surprised with this one. Wow. Wow. Okay, let's jump right in and make sure I didn't miss anything in the finish, and then I'm going to take my sweet time sipping on this. I should note it is well balanced before an IPA. I do like the hops to have more presence. It's that sweetness, strong ale, coffee stout. It's such an interesting flavor ride. It's very, very good. And once it kind of hits that top and then kind of apexes at the peak of its intensity, the sweetness comes back, and really what you're left with is lingering the hop kind of profile, and it's an earthy bitters, which I think is really appropriate in this beer style. That mixes with still that kind of residual coffee stout flavor. The strong ale kind of character really doesn't come back into the picture, and it finishes with kind of that coffee and earthy bitter hops. This is such a nice beer. I am really, really pleased that I chose this one. I haven't had this beer prior. I haven't done a Dogfish Head review yet, which is just kind of crazy to me. But this is a really great beer to start. Gets me excited for what's in number 2. So I'm going to take my time sipping on this, come up with my scores. When we get back, we will move on to the Burton Baton. This is an imperial IPA, 10%. That's a blend of a young and an oak-aged older IPA. So ought to be really interesting, and we'll be jumping into that next. Okay, so jumping into our second beer, this is Burton Baton, the Imperial IPA. It's 10% ABV, blend of a young IPA and an oak age older IPA. So I expect that to be really good in oak aging, always awesome. Let's see, bottle art. It's got a dude sitting on a barrel playing a guitar. That's about the extent of the bottle art. So let's just jump right in and get this poured in the glass. Yep, it's got a more amber appearance as I expect from an imperial. They typically are going to be darker in appearance as a rule. All right. Head formed, okay. It is quite occluded. This is hazy in appearance. I can tell you from here, I can already smell it. It smells very strong. Very hoppy, very boozy. It's got a slight sweetness to it, a slight mix of floral and kind of earthy aromas from the hops, maybe even a hint of some citrus coming through. And it smells like it has a little bit of a boozy edge to it. So this is a cloudy beer here. The head's already kind of dissipated out of the way. I was quite vigorous with the pour on this one too, but head creation and retention, not particularly great on this, but nonetheless, let's jump right in, give this a sip. Okay, interesting. Kind of went a little bit of a different direction, but then it gets back to pretty much what I expected. All right, so this is a great prototypical example of an imperial IPA. This is pretty much how the bulk of them kind of come out in my experience. Up front, when you get it in your mouth, there's a slight sweetness to it. And then once you swallow, it opens up, gives you a little bit of burst of hops, though it's not super hop forward. It's not hop intense. I wouldn't say that it's pungently bitter by any stretch of the imagination, even though it's an imperial IPA. After that develops, where it immediately turns and goes is into this rich, caramelly, almost buttery, buttered popcorn, buttered toffee-like flavor profile, which is typical of imperial IPAs in my experience. And as a hophead, it's one of the reasons I don't buy them often. I find once they add that many more fermentables into the beer to boost up the ABV, that the malt backbone starts to overpower and overshadow the hop and the hop bitters, which is the entire backbone of the IPA style. So I don't typically go for them as a rule. But that being said, this is a good imperial. Is it overtly bitter? Not by any stretch of the imagination. Certainly, the Indian Brown Dark IPA was substantially more bitter than this is. But these have completely different flavor profiles. The booze that you could pick up in the aroma also absolutely does come through in the beer. I'm going to jump back in for body mouthfeel and explore how this finish develops. Body's medium heavy, 10%. I expected it to be bigger. It's got some substance. Mouthfeel, it's nice. It's not silky creamy, but it's nice. It's kind of prototypical for an IPA. Yeah, up front you get that sweetness, and it opens up to that just small little burst of hops. Then that blooms into just really deep, rich caramel and buttered popcorn and toffee and buttered toffee. And as those kind of toffee, buttery flavors are evolving, that booze that you get on the nose makes a very big impression. It comes through quite strongly. It tastes quite boozy. And then that starts melding with all those buttery, toffee, caramel kind of flavors that roll around. And they just keep merging. And that's pretty much when it hits the apex of the finish, the intensity of flavor. Then it starts to dive down. As it dissipates, it's relatively stable and even in terms of the malts and the caramelly, buttery, toffee flavors you can taste, and that kind of booze that comes through in abundance. Cut that burp out, that's disgusting. And from there, it is pretty linear. There's a slight tail off at the end where kind of the boozy quality overpowers the malt quality. And that's just at the tail end. So it's a pretty even curve, you know, up the bell, then it apexes, and then it kind of straight line trajectory. And just before the bottom, it kind of peters off again. So you get kind of lingering booze and it tails off. Booze extends and the butter toffee's below it on the end of the curve. So overall, nice beer. It's kind of what I expected from an imperial. I would say it's a good, well done imperial. And yeah, it's nice. I'm going to take my time and sip on this, come up with my score. And when we come back, we will get both beers rated from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to go through getting them ranked. Starting with the Indian Brown, this is the Dark IPA, 7.2% ABV. This was the one brewed with organic brown sugar. And again, Dogfish Head is based out of Milton, Delaware. So, starting with the aroma on this one was nice. It was pretty pronounced for a standard IPA, but to be fair, 7.2, that's really getting up in ABV even for an IPA. So it definitely had more presence, and you could tell. It gets an 8 out of 10 for the aroma. For the taste, this was a very, very enjoyable beer that took me on a completely different ride than I anticipated. It just kept going in all sorts of different directions. And the various layers of flavor that kept opening up and then blending, it was just absolutely incredible. I really love this beer. If it had just had a bit more bitterness, a bit more hop presence, I would have given it a perfect score, but I still really enjoyed it. I'd give it a 9. For the body, 7.2% ABV again. For a standard IPA, that's still a pretty high ABV, so it had a good abundance of fermentables in there to add substance to it, and it definitely came through in the body. It was quite large. I gave it a 9 out of 10. Mouthfeel on this one. Mouthfeel came out really nice and really creamy. It wasn't quite that silky, creamy texture you get from an IPA off a tap, but it was pretty close. For at home, I thought it was exceptional. I give it a 9. Moving on to the finish. The finish on this was very nice, and it was quite complex, and it just kept melding flavors, and then one would open up, and another one would open up, and then they'd blend, and a new one would pop in, and it'd come back and divert, and it really had a nice staying power to it, too. I think if it had more hops, more alpha acids, and a little more viscosity to the mouthfeel, it probably could have helped the finish extend even longer, but it was still well above average. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Head and retention. Head and retention on this one was okay. High end of average, really. That, to be fair, that glass into which I'm pouring is not the best glass for getting a proper head formed. It's really more of a pub style glass than it is good for pouring a 12-ounce bottle. Larger beers do better because it's much larger in volumetric terms glass than many of the others that I have, but it did okay. I gave it a 6 out of 10. The appearance on this was a lovely beer. I think they nailed it when they called it a dark IPA. It's not a black IPA, that much was clear. It was dark, like a brown ale, and I thought it was lovely. 10 out of 10 for the appearance. Balance on this. This was a very, very well balanced beer. From an ingredient perspective and a malt perspective, it was just exquisitely balanced. The only thing, and I'm always going to come back to this when we're talking IPAs, it just needed more bitters. It needed more hops, or it needed more hops with higher alpha acid contents to boost up that bitter edge, that bitter punch. And it just wasn't quite there for me. If it had it, I would have rated it higher. But still, great score, 8 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, I absolutely loved it. This was a very enjoyable, very interesting beer. Everything that happened with the flavors that kept developing and emerging and re-emerging and developing, I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed. Even though it wasn't as hoppy and hop forward and bitter forward as I like in an IPA, the beer was still so good, I gave it a perfect 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, this is a fantastic beer. As an IPA, it's a fantastic beer. As a dark IPA, it's a fantastic beer. Really, the only gripe I have about this beer at all is just not enough hop presence. So I did take some points there. I gave it an 8 out of 10. That brings the total score on the Indian Brown to an 85 out of 100. So a very, very respectable score, certainly well above average, and I thoroughly enjoyed this beer. If you're a fan of IPAs or darker IPAs or darker bitters, this one, in my opinion, is well worth seeking. Very interesting beer. Moving on to number 2, Burton Baton, the Imperial IPA, 10% ABV that is a blend of a young and an oak-aged old IPA. For the aroma on this one, this is one of those beers that the aroma is so pungent you can smell it from feet away. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste on this, the taste was pretty much exactly what I expected for an Imperial IPA. I don't typically ever expect them to have a super hop forward, bitter forward kind of presence in a beer. As I've said many, many times, you start adding that many fermentables to boost the ABV up, and the malts just overpower the hop. They do. Hops, for all of their pungency, they are a delicate ingredient in beer, and it's easy to overpower them. So was this outside of the norm of what I expected? No. Did I think that it was still a nice example of an Imperial IPA? I did. It had quite a bit more complexity than your average Imperial in terms of just where that kind of buttery, toffee, caramelly. It wasn't as one-dimensional. It had distinctly different flavor profiles within that kind of flavor umbrella, and it kept interweaving, which kept me interested in the beer, even though it wasn't super hoppy at all. I gave it an 8 out of 10. The body on this one. This had a nice body. For a 10% Imperial, I did expect it to be larger than it was and to have more presence. It was a medium heavy. I expected at 10% it would be heavier than that, but still above average. I gave it a 7 out of 10. Mouthfeel on this one. The mouthfeel on this was nice. It wasn't super creamy. It wasn't super silky, but it was nice. Again, above average. I gave it a 7. Finish on this. This beer had a very interesting, very nice, very long finish. Much like the Indian Brown, it kind of kept moving in and out and melding different characteristics that you got from the beginning and the middle and the end all together, and there was just this interplay. And it had really nice staying power. Not the upper echelon, but only by just shy. I gave it a 9 out of 10. Head and retention on this one was not great. It was not as good as the Indian Brown, which admittedly wasn't great, but I said this was still just a little bit under. It wasn't terrible, but just middle of the road. I gave it a 5. Appearance-wise, This beer was quite a bit darker than I anticipated, and I didn't anticipate it to be occluded. I did rather expect it would be clear or mostly clear, and it kind of looked like murky, dirty water or bad apple cider or something. I don't know. Visually, it wasn't that appealing. It was too dark and it was too occluded. Technically, it was still in range, but you know, visually, it wasn't that appealing to look at. So, I still was fair with it, rating its appearance because it was within range color-wise, and they can be more clear or more cloudy. I split the difference. I gave it the high end of average. I gave it a 6. Balance-wise, this beer, for an imperial, it was okay. It kind of middle of the road for me in balance, and it's that same imperial IPA problem. Just not enough bitters, not enough hop presence. Really couldn't even detect it on the aroma, which goes in tandem with taste. Even though it had a pronounced aroma, you really couldn't get a sense of the hop characteristic, and it barely came through in the flavors. So for me, it was out of balance. I said middle of the road and high end. I gave it a 6. Feeling in the intangible, I enjoyed this beer. I thought it was better than your average imperial IPA, really strictly in terms of how interesting the flavors that developed were and how they kept interweaving. That in tandem with the length of the finish really helped me on this category, and I did give it above average. I gave it a 7. Finally, as an example of the style, there are a lot of imperial IPAs out there. The ones that are very bitter forward and hop forward are few and far between. This is kind of the average imperial IPA, which you can expect if you grab one and crack it open. I thought this did a good job. It's still hard for me to rate an IPA, imperial or otherwise, that just doesn't have a hop and bitter presence all that high, because there are some, it is doable. And it just takes time to get the balance right. I mean, just add in more alpha acids. That's the best suggestion I could make. Just more alpha acids. You know that when you start boosting up that ABV, that the malt is going to take on that buttery caramelly intensity, and it's going to drown the hop bitters, and that should never happen in an IPA, in my opinion. But I still gave it above average. I gave it a 7 out of 10. That brings the total score on Burton Baton to a 72 out of 100. So we're looking at a 13-point spread all total, and the standard IPA of the two got the higher ranking over the imperial, which, you know, it's just how it happens. It would be a rare thing for an imperial to beat a standard based on all of the characteristics that should go into an IPA, because the IPA is all about the hop. Nonetheless, folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in. As always, please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. If you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, you can just click the little notification bell icon right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.